Welcome everyone. Assalamu alaikum, marhaba. I wanted to start first with an acknowledgement and then we can go into our event. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various nations today. Pay my respects to the elders past and present and First Nations people participating with us today. Commit myself and invite me to join me in committing to the fight for Indigenous sovereignty until liberation and bearing witness to the truth that sovereignty has never been ceded. I want to acknowledge the history of over 200 years of Indigenous anti-colonial resistance and the martyrs that have been lost to the ongoing fierce struggle against British colonisation and Australian settler colonialism. I want to affirm that there can be no progress towards Palestinian liberation in appeals that legitimize normalize Australian. Israel sustains its settler colonial project without the fall of white supremacy. Our freedom is not only interconnected, but unattainable without the dismantling of all settler colonial structures. To begin, you can see this event was really a Nakba forum, and now we've kind of transformed it and modified it to be relevant to all of you for the current moment. So we wanted to start off by showing a short film from one of the Free Palestine Melbourne leaders. Her name is Shams Musa. She's put this Nakba story together that tells the story of her family. And then after that, I will invite Professor Tony Birch to reflect on resistance and movement work from our context within the settler colony. We will then hear from Sary, who will give us context on Sheikh Jarrah and historicize the current struggle there and the uprising and the fight against the expulsion. I will then call on Nasser Mashni, who will discuss with us pro-Palestinian activism and the priorities we need to center from our location in Australia. And then to conclude, Jordy will share her reflections on solidarities, statelessness, and possibilities from her positionality as a Jewish historian and also a fierce activist. So we're just going to share the video. Bear with us for a second.
Today, we remember the Nakba, the most devastating event in Palestinian history, when the Zionists systematically executed their plan to establish a state in Palestine. Their strategy always was, and continues to be, to acquire the maximum amount of land with the least amount of Palestinians. Nakba is the Arabic word for catastrophe, and it refers to the events of 1947 to 1948, which led to the loss of 78% of the land of historic Palestine and the expulsion of 820 indigenous Palestinians at the hands of terrorist Zionist groups. At the peak of Jewish military operations against Palestinian civilians, 70 massacres were committed, 531 Palestinian villages were destroyed, and 15,000 Palestinians were killed. This plan continues to this day with Israel's belligerent occupation of West Bank, including Al-Quds, tightened siege of Gaza, the forcible transfer of more and more Palestinians, the ongoing annexation of more Palestinian land, and the denial of return to more than 8 million Palestinian refugees.
I grew up all my life with a family that has never stopped speaking about Palestine and the return of Palestine. My name is Shams Musa, and I am a Palestinian refugee born in Lebanon lived my life in Australia. Every Palestinian has a Nakba story, and this is mine.
My grandparents were children when they were both driven out of Akbara. In May 1948, the Zionist gang attacked their peaceful village. My late grandfather was around 14 years old, and my grandmother was around 2 years old. They, along with their family and all the other villagers from Akbara, were driven into exile. My great-grandfather Musa was killed because he refused to leave his village. This forced my great-grandmother Rima to flee the village with my grandfather Mahmoud and his 5 siblings. My other great-grandmother Mariam was also forced to flee. In fact, if it weren't for her and the bravery of my great-uncle Rashid, my mother would not have been here with us today. Barely an hour after my great-grandparents were forced to flee their homes on foot, my great-grandmother Mariam realized they had left my grandmother Amina asleep in her bed and were forced to risk return.
I want you to take a moment and just imagine what went through the mind of my grandmother and everyone else in her family. Think of the sheer fear and the horror reflected upon them by the Israeli gangs. This alone is an answer to those who unjustly say Palestinians chose to leave. It was nearly 7 years before my parents were able to locate other family members after Nakba. My parents witnessed the beginning of refugee camps in both Syria and Lebanon. There, the refugees built their imaginary Palestine. They named the camp streets after their hometowns and villages, waiting until they return. My family had fled another wave of violence, and this time the Lebanese Civil War in 1976. Can you imagine the shock and the panic my parents experienced for the second time in their life? I was told later it was the bombshell that fell on our home and split the roof in Sabra Shatila camp and nearly killed myself and my brother. The bombshell landed on the bed where my brother and myself were playing. Today, my mother Amina tells us stories of what her parents witnessed during Nakba. It has been 73 years and my mother still is waiting, dreaming, and still believing she will return to Akbara. And we will return.
والله باسم الواحد الهاد والله بدينا رايات الفرح نرفعها بدينا.
Yeah, thank you, Shams, for sharing this with us. It's very heartfelt, and yeah, I think it resonates with a lot of us. The threads of that story are common to the Palestinian experience, but I'm sure to the experience of dispossession across refugee communities. So before I hand over to Professor Tony Birch, I just wanted to open with a few words that Professor Ghassan Haj has written in relation to the current political situation with the Palestinian uprising and then heightened, escalated aggression from Israel, as well as settler violence. So he narrates kind of a history of self-defense used to subjugate Indigenous people. And this is what he wrote. So I'll just read a small passage from that. So he says, guess what happened here? The English came and conquered. And then what happened? Colonial massacres, dispossession, subjugation, and sure enough, Indigenous resistance was followed by more massacres styled as retaliation. And for those who ask why more massacres, the Australian settlers explained that those Indigenous people were a serious murderous lot. They are attacking us and they have killed some of us. We have the right to defend ourselves. And guess what? Most white people agreed. They acted as if the difference between how many the Indigenous people have killed and how many the Australian settlers have killed is not important. They acted as if who invaded whose land is not important at all. They acted as if who is subjugating whom is not important either. They acted as if the only thing that mattered is the right to retaliate. They are attacking us and they have killed some of us and we have the right to defend ourselves. And I think it is worth repeating that this was a very selective way of describing the truth of what is going on. It was obvious to those who uttered the formula, but those who tried to point out that this was not the truth failed to understand something very important. Those who uttered this and similar sentences were not truth seekers. They were white colonial warriors. Their utterance was not a truth-seeking utterance. It was a warring formula that aimed to reinforce a white colonizing apparatus. And so here we are today, swimming in Zionist claims that the Palestinians are the ones attacking them and that, oh yes, they have the right to defend themselves. And then Hassan Haj goes on to say, blessed are those who have to defend themselves without having the power or the privilege to declare it a right. So that's the end of the passage. But yeah, I just wanted to say, I don't know how many Palestinians have been martyred or killed in the past 3 weeks in retaliation to their daring to refuse the ethnic cleansing plan and program, the Judaization of Jerusalem that is planned to proceed. I pray that Allah accepts all 200 or more of those who've been killed in Gaza as shuhada, because as Palestinians, we believe that our lives are worth giving to the protection of our homeland. As many of you know, I'm a Palestinian from Jaffa who has never visited Palestine due to the very same violence of expulsion that threatens the residents of Sheikh Jarrah. I can visit with an Australian passport, of course, but activism makes this precarious. And I also would rather step foot to a Palestine that is liberated within our lifetime. So I wanted to welcome you all today and thank you for joining us in this timely and hopefully energizing conversation, but also very serious and important one. We're honored to have such fierce scholars and movement leaders present with us today. I thought that this event needs to be relevant to the current moment so that we can have each of the panelists share a few reflections on resistance, uprising, and solidarity, and then we'll allow time for questions and contributions from all of you attending. We don't want it to be a kind of recipient relationship here. So I'll just introduce Professor Tony Birch, Indigenous author and writer. Yeah, over to you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. Just before I start, or while I start, I do need to start with an apology. If we haven't finished, I have to leave at 8:15. I told Tasnim earlier that I've got another Zoom meeting at 8:30, another event, so I have to prep for that. So I just want to be sure to the other panelists and also to the audience, if I don't come back at 8:15, it's nothing but utter respect for all of you. I just can't stay any longer. I do want to thank Tasnim for organising this. We've had associations in the past, particularly with the Black Palestinian Solidarity Conference that we had 2 years ago, and it was wonderful not only to meet her, but to meet other people as well. What I want to talk about, I do want to talk about some comparative issues of shared history or similar histories and resistance, but I need to start today by saying two other things. And firstly, for me, this is This is about our relationships, this is about our friendships, and this is about our shared sense of solidarity. So Aboriginal people in Australia in the last 50 years of activism have not only supported the Palestinian cause, we've had great support from Palestinian people about our own struggle. And those relationships that have been forged over those decades are very enriching for all of us. And I would state that they've established really long-term, not only political alliances, but more importantly, really dear friendships. And that is important to me because in recent years, I've got to know a lot more Palestinian people than I had in the past. And I find those relationships absolutely vital to who I am. And as an Aboriginal person and as a sovereign Aboriginal person, I take the notion that Palestinian people living on Aboriginal land need to be supported not only in their struggle abroad, but their sense of exile or how they feel about living in a country like Australia. It's also very important for me to say that I want to express my sadness, my support for the community here in Australia, what you're going through at the moment in relationship to the destruction of your country, in relationship to the impact on your loved ones, your community, your nation. I'm sure it is deeply traumatic. I'm sure that it is deeply distressing. And it's important that I let you know that not only myself, but all of my friends in the Aboriginal community who I associate with, who I'm a political ally with and friends with, we are very upset about what has happened, and we want you to know. And this I would express to every Palestinian person in the audience tonight, whether it be here in Melbourne, across Australia, anywhere across the globe, and certainly for people in your homeland, that we are very sad about what has happened, and we can guarantee you that our support for you will not waver, and our support for you will always be there. You can always rely on us because we know that we have always been able to rely on you. So we take that friendship and relationship very, very seriously. The other issue that I'm a bit hesitant to discuss or to think about is there are very important comparative histories, but I just again want to focus on what's happened in the last few weeks in Palestine. I want to think specifically about those events. I'm not trying in any way to dismiss the terrible violence that impacts on Aboriginal people in Australia today, particularly in relationship to incarceration, but not only incarceration, but what is happening at the moment in Palestine is particularly graphic, particularly distressing. So my sense is that I want to make sure that my attention is drawn toward supporting you. Having said that, I want to say something else about, I suppose, the relationships of what we might call settler colonial violence, its impact on our nations and on our countries, and what we need to do for each other in the long term to make sure that that support is tangible, that it is concrete. So I started by saying that I regard myself as a sovereign person. And what I mean by that is the same way I think that many Palestinians think we don't need our sovereignty granted to us by a government. In other words, we don't want our sovereignty granted to us by a foreign occupier or a colonial power or an invader. So when people talk about Aboriginal sovereignty in Australia, it's the same way it's expressed by people in Palestine. We're not seeking sovereignty from the settler occupier. We must express sovereignty within ourselves intellectually, politically, and emotionally. And the reason I say that here and its relevance to our Palestinian friends is our sovereignty in Australia comes with really really important responsibilities. So I want to say to people again that for Palestinians living in Australia, living in exile, or as Tasnim talked about, not being able to even step foot in their own country, we take responsibility for you while you are here. We take responsibility to care for you while you are here, and we take responsibility to support you while you are here and while you continue to struggle for your homeland. I do, though, now want to talk about some comparative issues, and I think that, yeah, we can think about the terrible destruction of physical violence, through the bullet, through the bomb, through attacks on people, through imprisonment, through incarceration. But what we know that's occurred alongside that, and this has been stated by other people, is that the whole idea of the violence of clearance. So one of the issues that is really to me strong in the sense of thinking comparatively about the destruction of Indigenous land, both in Palestine and Australia, is the bulldozer. So, you know, we've seen the shock and destruction of your homes in Palestine, and what we see in Australia is often the destruction of our home and homelands because of mining, because of development, because of some need to so-called economically improve land, but that of course is a means of destroying land and destroying, as we would say in Australia, country. And I think that what is tellingly relative here, and this is really important, I think, in relationship to Nakba and what has happened in recent weeks, is that both in Australia and in Palestine and in Jerusalem in particular, is that what happened in the last few weeks with Nakba, the refusal to allow people to commemorate in ways that they wanted to, is that what is happening there is a refusal to accept truth. So what colonial authorities have done traditionally in both countries is a means of trying to silence people, to try and silence people from being active, to try and silence people, as we saw in that really important film that introduced us here tonight, for people wanting to be truth tellers, people seeking to tell the truth about the destructive impact on colonialism in their society. And this is very similar in Australia as it is in Palestine. And it has followed a very similar path for many, many years now. Now, because of that, as we saw in this film, as we see in activism, as we see in the protests in the street, as we see in gatherings like tonight, as we see in relationship to literature, so I've been introduced to great Palestinian writers in recent years, we have an absolute responsibility to be engaged in a form of truth-telling. So it's very important for all of us that we not only get the so-called message out, but we're able to counter these stories of refusal and denial by informing people about the truth of what has happened in both our countries. And I've been very fortunate, as I said, because of my associations with the Palestinian community, to get a much greater and in-depth understanding of those histories and stories that I would otherwise not have access to because of the media. And I also know that this puts a lot of responsibility and I think sometimes stress on people. So I would say to our Palestinian friends, like with our Aboriginal friends, because we need to share the load. We need to support each other and share the load of sharing those stories so we don't get burnt out and destroyed by the activism we're involved in. And the other thing I think it's relative to this, and just sum up with a couple of points, is that the other issue, of course, is the way that memory has become a strategy, a political device, a fiction. And I think in relationship to Palestine, again, I think when I'm reading some of the reports coming out, when I get access to some of the histories of, say, the history of the origins of Nakba, is what the Israeli government attempts to do, whether it be to remove people from houses, to remove people from community, to bulldoze communities, to do terrible violence as is being enacted now. It's not only to destroy physical places, not only to destroy people, but it is to destroy the legitimacy of the memory of what actually has happened in this country, so that the fiction that is told that overlays this cleared land, that overlays the houses that people have been thrown out of, it creates a means of silencing the past. So I think we also have a shared responsibility to make sure that those stories of the past are shared, disseminated, and we get them out there. I suppose the last thing I want to say, and it goes back to Ghassan's introduction in some way, and that is the corruption of the way people talk about violence, the way people talk about defending themselves, and certainly the way people talk about human rights. I think what is, for me, one of the most, what angers me so much at the moment, and I shouldn't be surprised because I've seen this all my life, is the selective support of human rights, which of course renders any support of human rights obsolete. And we know, just for instance, in the US, that we know during the election last year that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, it was very important for them to give a nod to the Black Lives Matter movement because they were reliant on turning out millions and millions of African-American voters, which they were able to do, or certainly increase the vote amongst African-American voters. When we hear not only the silence in relationship to what's happening in Palestine, but more than that, proactive support of Israel, it not only is disgraceful in the way that the human rights of Palestinian people are ignored by someone like the US powers, it's important to say that any claims they make to support of human rights in relationship to any country, any ally, I think should be disregarded, because you cannot support the human rights of one person or one group of people and deny them to another. And we need to also make sure we get that story out there. So I just want to say in conclusion that it is true, as Tasnim talked about, there are very strong comparative histories between Aboriginal people in Australia and Palestinians, very strong. And I just want to say that we need to make sure that we continue to support you at this moment. And we do so knowing that we always can rely on you for support when we need it. I don't think I've been to an Invasion Day rally where I haven't seen a really strong Palestinian contingent, and it means so much to us, and we will reciprocate in whatever way we can. So thank you very much for inviting me tonight.
Thank you. And it's an honor for us to have you with us as well. I wanted to just say to the audience, because Tony's leaving early, if you had any questions specifically to him, you can send them through, and maybe I can give some time for those to be answered after we go to Sary. But for now, I'll introduce Sary. So Sary is an artist and cultural historian. He completed a PhD in fine arts at Monash University in 2014, looking at the confluence of biblified imaging of the Palestine and Zionist narrative. His research interests sit at the intersection of colonialism, indigeneity, religious narrative, and visual culture. He's also Palestinian and Australian. So over to you.
Thanks, Tasnim. And, thank you so much for organising this event, which I think has been rather an evolving event, given the ways in which things have played out in the last few weeks. So, I think the sort of frameworks for what we've all been thinking about has sort of have been sort of moving along with sort of political events as they go. But in the end, one of the things about the current moment, I think, is that we all understand that there is a sort of a much longer history to what's going on in Palestine at the moment, to what's going on in Jerusalem, to the sort of history of this conflict. But sometimes understanding some of those contexts can be a little bit opaque for people. I mean, I think some of the debates around what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah are, we sort of hear about the current situation as a property dispute and a conflict over property. We hear about this as a sort of an aspect of settler colonialism. We hear about, sort of ideas of war and conflict versus settler colonialism and how these sort of intersect, and sometimes these debates can seem a little bit opaque, I think. So one of the things that I really wanted to do today was just to talk a little bit about Jerusalem, about its history, and about the history of Sheikh Jarrah. And we have a few slides that I wanted to put up. So I'm going to actually start off in 1918 at the end of the First World War. And for those of you who don't know too much about Palestinian history, Palestine, along with most of the Levant, had been under Ottoman rule, that is Turkish rule, up until 1918. And in the sort of period of the First World War, first of all, British forces, along with Australians and New Zealand forces, came over from Egypt through Gaza up towards Jerusalem and slowly started conquering that territory. And this is the moment which gave birth to a lot of the states that now exist. So the Southern Levant basically fell under a British sphere of influence, in which British Mandate Palestine was set up, as was Jordan. And then in the north of the Levant, we had the creation of Lebanon, which was carved out of Greater Syria. Now, historically, none of these borders had really existed. So this is a sort of a very formative time. But one of the first things that the British did when they captured Jerusalem, which was just before Christmas in 1917, in fact, Lloyd George, the then British Prime Minister, described the capture of Jerusalem as a Christmas present to the British people, which perhaps gives us a sense of how Jerusalem was regarded. But one of the first things that they did, even before before urban planners had arrived in Jerusalem, was to start doing urban plans for Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem had changed quite radically through the course of the 19th century. In the 1850s, it became an administrative center for the Ottoman Empire, and it very rapidly, it sort of went through a process of suburbanization with the setting up of leafy middle-class garden suburbs, people moving out of the old city and setting up these kind of new modern estates. Now, the urban plan that you can see on your screen here, it actually was never actually brought into fruition, partially because actually much of West Jerusalem had already been built by this stage. But it does give you a bit of a sense of how the city kind of functioned. So actually, if we can go, yeah, thank you. So if we actually have a look, you can see the old city in the center there, and this sort of grid plan, which was the sort of the new, what was known as in those days, the new city. And this was the sort of the modern suburbs. This was the people, as people became more affluent, as the middle, there was this rise of the middle class, people started to move out. Now, Sheikh Jarrah was part of that, and it sort of sat on the edge of it. What you can see on the east side, on the right-hand side of this map, however, is a fairly sort of empty space. I mean, we have Silwan, which is to the southeast, which is a very ancient village that's very, very near the old city and is now very much part of Jerusalem. But actually, this area was, it was partially very mountainous and did have some villages, but it was sort of, it was much less populated. So when we think about this division of East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem that happens in 1948, really what we're talking about is actually the old city being cut off, from this kind of, this modern hub of modern Jerusalem that developed in the 19th and early 20th century. And if we go to the next slide, I think, we can start to see some of the sort of the contemporary impacts there. And actually, this map gives us a sense of what Jerusalem is like relatively recently. We can see the sort of the West Jerusalem, which is blanked out there, which is in Israeli territory. But we can also see the line of where the green line, which is the division between 1948 and the sort of the West Bank. And then we get a sense of the sort of the built-up areas around it. So the sort of mustard-coloured are Arab areas, and the blue coloured areas are Israeli settlements. So it sort of gives you a sense of how complicated this sort of jigsaw of contemporary Jerusalem is. To give you a sense of how big the geography is, you can see Bethlehem in the south there, just beneath the red line. And that is, I mean, to put it in Australian terms, it's probably about the distance of Preston to Melbourne CBD. And then in the north, we can see at the very top of the map there, Ramallah. And to give you a sort of a sense of that, that's probably about the distance of Strathfield to Sydney CBD. So this is not, this is not a sort of a large space. Now, Sheikh Jarrah, if we flick to the next slide, it is immediately outside the old city walls to the north. So as you're walking out of Damascus Gate, you're immediately faced with Nablus Road, which is one of the major streets. Slightly to the east of that, you've got Salah ad-Din Street, which again is another sort of very important street in Sheikh Jarrah. And if you sort of see to slightly to the west of that, you can see these dotted lines, which mark out exactly where the green line was. So Sheikh Jarrah, it really sits on this, even though it's in East Jerusalem, it's to the north of the old city. And it really sits on this seam line between East and West. And if we think about, the sort of the historical sort of commercial and cultural center of Jerusalem, it was partially in Sheikh Jarrah and partially just in this sort of this eastern area here, where you can see some of these more sort of tan colored areas, places like Mamilla Road, Jaffa Street, etc. Now, the thing about Sheikh Jarrah, it's very easy to think of it as a ghetto, seeing these images, seeing this sort of like, this plastic chairs being thrown around and all of this sort of stuff. But actually this area, it is one of the sort of, particularly after 1948, it became one of the major cultural centers of East Jerusalem. You know, it houses a lot of important Palestinian institutions. It houses things like the Palestinian National Theatre. It houses Dar al-Tifl, which is the folklore museum. It has Dar Isaf Nashashibi, which is the literary and cultural center. It also hosts a lot of important cultural institutions, like the foreign cultural institutions like École Biblique or the Kenyan Institute, which both sponsor a lot of research. And, you know, when it was first built, it was, you know, it was this very leafy garden suburb. It was Muslim elites who were moving out of the old city and kind of establishing these sort of spaces. Another very important institution is the American colony, which, you know, was a very fundamental cultural institution in Jerusalem. They had their fingers in a whole bunch of different pies, from commercial interests through to cultural interests. They've left us one of the largest photographic archives of late Ottoman and Mandate Palestine in existence, which is in the in the Library of Congress now. So, you know, when we see these images, it's not just a question of displacement that we're dealing with. We're actually talking about a space in which there is cultural institutions and a cultural space that is under attack. And I think the threat of these sorts of things is very real. In fact, you know, people are now describing this as potentially a third intifada. But if we think back to the second intifada, institutions like Orient House, which was the Palestinian diplomatic, the Palestinian Authority diplomatic mission in East Jerusalem, which was just off the Nablus Road, was actually closed down during this period. All of the computers were taken, all of the files were taken. And even though it was protected under the Oslo Accords, it was done very specifically to seal Israeli sovereignty over East Jerusalem. So when we think about what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah, it's not just about the displacement of people, which is horrible enough, but it's also about actively trying to undermine Palestinian culture in this city. And I think that we need to be really sort of conscious of how the cultural plays alongside, you know, the political. You know, I think that this sort of starts to raise a whole bunch of questions about the viability of Palestinian life in the city. And I mean, certainly spending time in Jerusalem over the last 15 years, you know, we see a lot of Palestinian youth who are no longer kind of going out in East Jerusalem. A lot of places are closing down. They either go over to the west side of Jerusalem, where, you know, they often feel uncomfortable, or they head to Ramallah of an evening, or Bethlehem. So there is a sort of a cultural constriction that's going on alongside this. And I think, you know, as we sort of see this constant Judaization and settlement activity that's going on in East Jerusalem, we need to be really conscious, not just of protecting people and you know, stopping the displacement of people, but also stopping the displacement of culture, because this is part of the broader displacement. And I think, you know, I mean, I think this has sort of been a very long-term strategy, whether we think about, you know, the archives that have wound up in the materials, the cultural materials that have wound up in Israeli archives that are very, very rarely made available to Palestinians, you know, either from the Nakba or the theft of material from the Palestinian Research Center in Beirut during the civil war and the Israeli invasion. You know, just 2 days ago, the IDF broke into Dar Yusuf Jasser in Bethlehem, one of the sort of new contemporary art institutions in Bethlehem, and a lot of material was taken there, and you know, there was damage to the building. So I think we need to be thinking really in very, you know, multiple layers of terms about what's going on in Jerusalem. It's not just a question of people, but also a broader question of some sort of Palestinian culture. I think particularly within the context of the ID system and seeing how, you know, Palestinians are prevented from coming from the West Bank, people with Palestinian ID in the West Bank are prevented from coming to Jerusalem. This sort of colonization takes on these multiple layers, which is a very disturbing development. On that note, I might pass it back to Tasnim, and we can answer questions later.
Okay, thank you, Sary. I found that really insightful and educational. As I was telling you, like before we started, a lot of this history is not really taught to us. There's a concerted effort, obviously, to erase it. And for those of us, particularly in diaspora, we find it hard to kind of access and find spaces where we can learn this. So I'm really grateful that you could share that knowledge with us, and also particularly in contextualize it within the current kind of events and what the people of Sheikh Jarrah are facing. So I thought before we continue with the panels, we will ask a question to Professor Tony Birch. So I have one question here, and feel free to go with it and address it however you like. But yeah, so the person asking is saying, from your experience with Indigenous activism and resistance, what tips do you have for activists in the Palestine solidarity movement here in Australia? And what are some of the things you have learned that have been really helpful to keep you going in your fight?
Thank you very much. I'll answer the question. It's a good question. I just briefly want to just respond to Sary's. There are a couple of really relevant points here about comparative history. And when Sary got on to talk about this is not about people only, this is all about also about the destruction of culture. It is so relevant to the situation in Australia. And similarly, that Sary talked about not only the archives of controlling the memory, controlling the stories, denying Indigenous people the right to access archives. It's a very similar situation in Australia, where there are massive archival holdings of material to deal with Aboriginal culture that are very difficult to get access to. Worse than that, museums both in Australia and internationally hold major holdings belong to Aboriginal people, and we cannot even look at a lot of that material. And when we can't have that material moved home. So these are important cultural artifacts, human remains that are held by colonial powers across the world. So that is a very similar situation. And of course, it relates to the destruction of sites in a similar way also. And this in Australia, of course, is not the military, but the mining industry, which has given enormous power in Australia to destroy Aboriginal sites, as we've seen in recent years. So yes, it is very, very similar. What advice would I give? Firstly, and I say this, as humbly as I can, I'm loath to give advice to Palestinian people, because in one way I'm thinking right here off the top and with my heart that what you're dealing with is so difficult, so destructive, so distressing, that however you're dealing with it is, for me, you're doing the best you can. And I wouldn't be as patronizing to suggest that you do this or you do that. So I will give some advice, but firstly, again, to reiterate, I think for one of the issues around activism is that it does take a toll on you. It is stressful. It takes a lot of energy out of you, and it's important to solidify yourself into larger groups, and I say dedicated groups. Some people do like to latch onto our struggles, and people will know this in the Palestinian community as much as the Aboriginal community, and people love a good activist t-shirt. We've got to be careful who we get involved with, because unless people are in for the long struggle, unless people are willing to support each other for the duration, they're actually a hindrance, because you can think that you have the support of people, and when you really need it, it's not there. As people know, I'm a very good friend of Professor Gary Foley, and we applied the barricade test, and that is that when push comes to shove and you've got to defend yourself, and you're on that front line and you've got to defend yourself against the police, whoever it is, the people who matter are the ones who stay there and will be there with you. So you need to be sure that if you're calling on allies, which is very helpful, that they are people who are really committed, not people just in it for the romance or the brief adventure. I suppose the more important advice I'd give, and this is really telling, is that one thing I know is that the struggle that I'm involved in, or the activism I've been involved in, it is nothing compared to what Aboriginal people had to go through historically in this state and across Australia. So what I know is that Aboriginal men and women were threatened with their life and paid the price of their life defending the rights of Aboriginal people. They did so with nothing, with no money. They did so with no resources, and they did so for their whole lives. So I know of Aboriginal women who I've researched and written about. I know women who have spent 40, 50 years every day of their life as activists at a grassroots level. So what I say to people today is that we are following in the footsteps of giants, and I mean that literally. And when we think about the struggle getting difficult, or if we think it's stressful, we do need to consider those who have come before us often had much more difficult issues to deal with, and yet they left us a great legacy. So I think you've got to look to the leaders that have been before you in your community. You've got to, again, get access to the stories of those struggles, and you've got to take sustenance from it. You've got to take encouragement from it, so that it's the way that I always think. And when I talk to younger people, I don't suggest that activism for younger people is easy. It's always difficult. It always requires energy. Just to say to them, think about this auntie who wrote a letter of complaint to the government from her kitchen table on a reserve where she had so restricted access in her life, and yet she did it. And when we think about Palestine, and again, I don't want to in any way give advice to Palestinian people about how to deal with your own struggle. You know what a difficult struggle it is, far better than I do. But I would suggest that you think about your elders. So in the film that we saw opening tonight, that wonderful young man and his mother was talking, and he told the story of his grandmother and his great-grandmother and their struggle. They're the stories that you've got to remember, because when you look at the stories of that historical struggle, I think you'll be inspired to keep going. So that's all I would suggest. And but keep yourself fit, keep yourself healthy. So if you want to be an activist for life, you got to keep your knees in good order so you can march in the street. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question we had here that maybe Tony wanted to speak to. So the person is asking, would you say Jerusalem Day is comparable to Invasion Day here in so-called Australia? And how can we as allies encourage the pro-Israeli Zionist community here to question Israeli narratives? To question Israeli narratives in the way that, you know.
Yeah. Look, I don't want to take up too much more time because other people have a lot to say. I wouldn't know how to encourage pro-Israeli Zionists in Australia to do anything. In fact, I'm not going to answer that part of the question. So I haven't got a clue how you would overcome that. I don't know, give them happy tablets or something. I'd be more interested to say yes, Jerusalem Day, because reading more and more about these issues, one of the things we know about Jerusalem Day is the terrible processions through Palestinian neighborhoods and Palestinian land, the assaults on Palestinians on that day. I've read a lot about the people sort of trying to arrest Palestinian people out of their homes and insulting people. Yes, I think it is very similar to Australia Day, this tradition of patriotism that by some might be sort of oblivious to the real issues of the time, but I think the patriotism, the flag waving, the violence that comes with those days, the hyper masculinity and Australia, I actually think it's very similar, because I don't think it's a benign celebration. I don't think it's just about having a barbecue and putting on a silly t-shirt. I think it's the worst form of nationalism. The undertones are not only violent, the undertones of this are about colonial conquest. It is about conquest. And so therefore, yes, I think its relationship to Jerusalem Day is entirely similar, and I think very apt. And I think what we have to do to combat it is, and again, people in Palestine would be putting themselves in danger very much in these situations. I can only say that in Australia, that the Invasion Day rallies have got bigger and bigger each year. which is really because of the remarkable work done by warriors of Aboriginal resistance. And what I would say there, if there are younger people listening tonight, or parents with teenagers and younger people, I would say this: if anyone asked me what's the real success of Invasion Day and what's the real success of Warriors of Aboriginal Resistance, and people often say, well, what's going to happen next? What are they going to do that's constructive? What are they going to do that changes the narrative? I understand all those questions, but I would say it's one thing I can guarantee people, that the empowerment of young Aboriginal people, of seeing Aboriginal people out in the street in such numbers, seeing our allies out in the street with such numbers, it really invigorates those young people. And going back to Sary's point, when you see your culture being belittled, destroyed, when you see your culture being spoken of in very negative, disparaging ways, to have a sense of collective support of your community in the street with 50,000, 100,000 people, I know that young Aboriginal people feel really invigorated by that, and it makes really fundamental change in their values and their sense of self. So we need to make sure that our young people don't become dispirited to the extent that they are themselves immobilized. We need to mobilize young people, not destroy their heart.
Yeah, definitely. I always think of, when it comes to this kind of like heightened violence, it can either radicalize you or it can also depoliticize you. So there's both of those effects, I guess. Well, thank you very much for taking the time out in such short notice to be with us and to join us today. I don't know if you wanted to make any last remarks. Okay. Well, yeah, just feel free to, I guess, stay as long as you wanted to. We'll move now to Nasser Mashni. So let me just introduce you and then you can take the mic. Where is this? Yep, so many of you know Nasser already, but Nasser Mashni is the Vice President of the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network. And the son of a Palestinian refugee. He is a co-founder of Australians for Palestine, a founding board member of Olive Kids, and CEO of a financial services company. With his father's legacy in mind, Nasser is determined to continue the struggle for justice and a free Palestine. And we're also very honored and grateful that you're with us today, Nasser. So over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tasnim. And thank you to all of the panelists that are with us, and good to see you again, Sary, and particularly Professor Tony. Thanks so very much for your very powerful words. And I'm glad you can hear, if you can stick around for a little bit of my talk, and particularly the challenges we had as Palestinians assimilating, but also making that connection with our shared struggles. So first, I'd like to also acknowledge the fact that I'm on Wurundjeri land, and particularly as a Palestinian, one of the things that is very challenging for me is as a settler living on unceded and colonised land. So to Wurundjeri elders past and present and emerging, my deepest respects, and I acknowledge that this land, that sovereignty has never been ceded, and that your connection to your land is long and as deeply rooted as ours, and that our shared struggles of indigeneity will ensure that our freedom and justice will prevail at some point. I was asked by Tasnim, and look, I'm not very often intimidated, and I don't actually get nervous, but when Tasnim asked me to join this panel, I was like, it's a pretty smart panel, I'm a bit of a dummy. But she made me feel a little bit more comfortable that I had something to offer. And something I want to share with you is, in fact, my father's journey in Australia, and his journey particularly with respect to activism and where we stand today as Palestinian activists on a precipice of something very, very exciting. My father came to Australia in the 50s as a stateless person. He spent a couple of years in internment in Shepparton, and then managed to make it to Melbourne and get a job, etc. Met my mum in the 60s. He told her that he was already married. She said, "What are you doing here then if you're already married?" He said, "Well, I'm married to Palestine." And my mother tells a story that he kind of wished that he'd had another wife, because she'd had a fair fight against another woman, but she could never compete with Palestine. I attended my first rally in my mum's belly in the late 1969. Our land room was the epicenter of all things Palestine. And I say that from the point of view of, we didn't have an ambassador then. This was before Ali Kazak came and before Australia became, well, Palestine became really quite organized in the sense of embassies and so forth. Our lounge room smelt like coffee. The smell of cigarettes just permeated throughout the whole house. So he had a very, very tough time back then in the 60s and 70s. And particularly because Australia, like Israel, they share the same mythology, terra nullius, here in Australia. And in Palestine, a land without people for a people without a land. Hollywood did its great work. Paul Newman, the movie Exodus, the concept of the kibbutz and the socialist ideal. We made the desert bloom. All of these great lies that Zionists perpetuated to increase their connection to the land, but also to remove our connection, as Sary was touching on earlier on before. In the early 70s, our friends at that time were, my father called them the correct Labor Party. That was actually the far left of the Labor Party. And they were dear friends of my late fathers, like John Halfpenny, Bill Hartley, George Crawford. These were very principled men of the Labor Party back then. My father facilitated a delegation to go to Beirut to meet with President Arafat in the early 70s. And that was the bedrock, if you will, the start of that sort of connection for the Labor Party with Palestine. Sadly, as Bob Hawke and that right-wing section of the Labor Party took control, Bob Hawke gets elected, and his Zionism in his DNA really took the Labor Party off on a tangent that made things so very different for the Labor Party as we might have hoped for it to be back then. The 70s also saw the late King Hussein come to Australia in 1976. That was my first, as a 6-year-old, our house was raided by ASIO. We were put under arbitrary arrest. There was a belief at the time that perhaps my father might lead some sort of mission against King Hussein. Look back now, it was really, really quite funny, but I can't imagine it was much fun then. 76 was also another pivotal year. In 1976, my father drove to Melbourne University with a late dear friend, David Dejani, to meet with a young John Karkar, who later became a most eminent Queen's Counsel and an active supporter and a Palestinian active supporter of ours, obviously. And he met with my father and David Dejani, met with John Karkar, who was then a tutor at the University of Melbourne. And he had Sary's father, Eddie Zananiri's second year American University of Beirut Certificate of Architecture. And as John tells it, he was ordered to find a place in the architecture facility for Eddie Zananiri. And amazingly, less than half an hour later, John Karkar came back and had found a place for Eddie, and he was registered as a third-year student in architecture. So a bit amazing. What's particularly amazing is the Zionist campaign. He was able to do that, but the Zionist campaign against Eddie was just Orwellian in proportion, etc. He was at the time the vice president of the General Union of Palestinian Students, and a really active and dear friend, and as you can tell from his son, obviously a great guy. Dad exhausted himself endeavoring to empower Palestinians. If we go back to that 70s and 80s and even into the early 90s, if you said you're Palestinian, you'd hear people would reciprocate with, are you Pakistan? And they say, no, Palestine. And you try and explain to them where Jesus was born is often something we used to say to try and geographically locate us to the layperson. But, it was Pakistan. Palestinians that came to Australia generally came in that sort of civil war period of Lebanon in the late 70s, early 80s, and they came to escape. And they got here, and the first thing they did, many of them, was immediately deny their Palestinianness. They would say, well, Lebanese were Jordanian, Syrian, were Egyptian. They just didn't want the pain or damage or challenge that being a Palestinian might associate to you. And you know, my father was, I'm proud of Palestinian. You can be proud of Palestinian. Don't deny your right to be who you are. But also, and this is, you know, the thing that my father held so dearly to himself, was you made it out, you owe it to those that are still back there. More often than not, sadly, that plea fell on deaf ears. And in fact, it fell on such deaf ears that many of that generation of Palestinians didn't even educate their children on Palestine, thinking they were protecting their children by not teaching them about Palestine, denying them their connection to their roots, and endeavouring to smooth a road for themselves, if you will. And so many Palestinians in the early stage endeavoured to assimilate themselves in this colonial state. You know, they didn't realise that they were settlers here. And so when we talk about intersectionality today, I'm so proud of our Palestinian community today and of Tony seeing us. And I know that I've been going to Invasion Day rallies for I think 17 or 18 years, close to 20 years, that contingent of Palestinians keeps increasing. And I'm so proud that this generation understands the connectedness of our struggles. But it was a huge challenge back then. And I'm particularly proud this past week, what the thing I can take away, aside from the pain and the suffering and the dread of the cataclysmic and brutal murder of our people in Gaza, and the dozens now killed in the West Bank, and the pogroms happening within 48 Palestine, is the rise of that next generation here in Australia, in their activism, in the being activated, in their leadership. And as much as that's empowering to see that generation, it's so awesome to see that it's predominantly women-led. And it gives me such great pride that effort, what my father flagellated himself, absolutely beat himself. I mean, we were raised by my mother. Dad was an absentee person to us. To see that, you know, that hard work wasn't wasted, that in fact, you know, the Palestinian movement in Australia is well led. And I'd hate to be a Zionist trying to sell that shit that they're trying to sell 10 years from now, when these kids, and I'll say kids because I'm now an elder, I'm told, that when these kids really hit their straps. The work never stopped. President Arafat died in 2004. Sonia Karkar, John Karkar's wife, and I had a meeting about what we might do. And from there, we had a new ambassador come to Australia, a little bit more sophisticated. And from that, some thoughts and things that how we might end up, Australians to Palestine was born. And from that, we endeavoured to create a more polished lobby group, if you will. That's now morphed into the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, which is a national peak representative body with lobby, we do media stuff, youth engagement. I'm so proud of the Black Palestine Conference that so many that are on here, and some of our panelists were huge drivers in late 19. And our movement now is so diverse and so empowered. It's led by youth, the intersectionality and connectedness of the Palestinian struggle, but also with our Indigenous brothers and sisters here, and Indigenous peoples all over the world. You know, I'm sure our liberation isn't too far away. Sary spoke about Sheikh Jordy, but I just want to just quickly touch on a couple of things about why those expulsions, not evictions, expulsions, are so triggering for us as Palestinians. As Palestinians, we grew up, as Shams showed in her story, and Sary and Tasnim could both talk about their own Nakba stories. We were told these stories through quivering lips of our grandparents and parents. The pain was visceral. Watching those expulsions is high definition replaying of that trauma 73 years ago. For us, whether we're in 48 Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, or refugees around the world, seeing that reminds us of what happened, and we're not letting it happen again. We're not letting it happen again. That level of ethnic cleansing is not going to happen on our watch. So that's one of the things that Israel does with respect to Jerusalem, is it issues a special identification to separate Palestinians from each other. 48 Palestinians are citizens of the State of Israel. Jerusalem Palestinians carry a blue ID. West Bank Palestinians carry a green ID. Refugees don't have any ID. Gazans have a separate ID. Well, the Palestinians within Jerusalem are not citizens. They're permanent residents of a state that doesn't allow them to vote or recognise them as there. They need to prove that Jerusalem is the centre of their life. Since 1967, when Israel conquered Jerusalem and the West Bank, some 20,000 Palestinians have had their residency revoked. And that's all part of a policy to Judicize Jerusalem. It's ethnic cleansing. The Nakba didn't finish in 1948. It's ongoing, and we saw its most recent manifestation in Sheikh We know what this is, which is why we're making sure that we won't let them do it again. Very quickly, I just want to talk quickly about DFAT. DFAT asked for Australians, their thoughts on a free trade deal with Israel. And the reality of our trade with Israel is that it would heavily advantage Israel because we're net importers. And the bulk of our import is in fact military stuff from Elbit Systems. Elbit promotes itself worldwide as the world leading exponent of military technologies, etc. But they're proud. On their website it says battle tested. And what we're seeing in Gaza today is battle testing. They take this technology around the world and say, it works, have a look how good it is. Whether it's drones, whether it's border control fences, it's facial recognition software. It's all of the artificial intelligence that the Palestinians that rose up to defend Al-Aqsa all got a text message saying, we geotagged your phone as being at Aqsa during these protests. We're coming to get you. We're coming to get you. This is the sort of technology, whether it's phone tracking and phone hacking, geotagging, etc., that Israel sells to repressive regimes all over the world. Now, our Australian Defence Forces looks like they're cancelling their contract with Albert, and they're cancelling it not out of a principled decision because they want to deal with war criminals and a country that is occupying brutally an Indigenous people, but they're cancelling them because when we're doing, Australia, we're doing war games with the United States actually takes precautions against Australian forces because we use this Albert stuff, because allegedly they don't even trust what's going on there. This is after giving them $4 billion a year in military aid. To give you an idea of where Australia is one of a handful of countries that actively lobbied the International Criminal Court to say that you do not have jurisdiction in Palestine. I mean, just the level of, we're the same guys as you would beg it to believe. And I know I probably have gone over a little bit of time. Sorry, Tasnim. I'm an elder, so I'm allowed to. I just want to finish with why Palestine's so important. And particularly to those people that are watching today, Palestine's so important because the far right, whether that's Modi or Bojo or Orban or Duterte in the Philippines or Bolsonaro in Brazil, the far right knows that Palestine's the first domino. The struggle against Zionism, a supremacist colonial mindset that has only been successful for 73 years, it's 100 and something years old, 120 years old, that this domino is the first domino in the global struggle of humanity, against colonialism, racism, and inequality. And there is a reason they are fighting so hard to keep Israel. There's a reason they get that support. There's a reason that Netanyahu and Orban, an anti-Semite who ran a campaign with bus signs saying George Soros, they are trying to steal this election. There's a reason that he is friends with Orban, he's friends with all of these people, and they're friends with him, is that this is the domino in the fight against colonialism, racism, and inequality. And this is why they're protecting Israel. And they know to lose Israel is not losing the battle, it is the war. So Palestine needs you, justice needs you, we need you, and together we will see a world that we will be proud to give to our children. So Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, for these remarks, Nasser. I feel like it was really powerful the way you outlined some of that history, because it gives weight to the work and to the struggle as well. You know, a lot of people think it's kind of momentary action, or just, you know, kind of reacting when there's an onslaught. But clearly, you know, there's a long legacy, and also a kind of intergenerational transmission of a lot of knowledge, which is part of decolonial work as well, you know, to be able to capture that, document it, but also, you know, draw on that in informing what we do today. So I'm really kind of thankful that you shared that with us. In terms of Albert systems, actually, well, I was going to say this later, but I'll just put it in the chat now. So there's the West Papua group. They're also fighting Albert systems because they're complicit in the violence that they're subjected to. So on Tuesday at 11, is it 11? I'm not sure exactly what time, it says in the event, but they're asking people to come and march against the armed dealers, and in solidarity with communities from West Papua, Colombia, Palestine, and Myanmar. So they're saying to meet at Westgate Park, Port Melbourne at 11 a.m. And to bring megaphones, pots, pans, and drums. So BDS Australia is going to collaborate in that, and this is going to be a kind of focus for the Palestine solidarity movement as a way to counter the Israeli violence that is occurring at the moment. So it's a way, it's really a way that shows how the issues are very transnational. And yeah, so there's a demonstration on Saturday, but there's also the one on Tuesday that a lot of us are going to show up to as supporters of Palestine. So before we go to questions, we do want you to send through any points you want us to raise, because we wanted to open this as a space for all of you to learn, express some of how you're feeling. We just thought like holding this space and having this gathering would hopefully be valuable in some way. But before we go to that, we wanted especially to have Jordy with us and give us some concluding remarks on solidarities, etc. So I'm going to just introduce you and then hand it over to you. And a lot of us, I think, are keen to hear what you have to say. So Jordy, Dr. Jordy Silverstein is a Jewish historian and writer based in Naarm, Melbourne. She's the author of Anxious Histories, narrating the Holocaust in Jewish communities at the beginning of the 21st century, published by Forgone Books in 2015. And she researches Jewish memories of the Holocaust, histories of Australian Jewish sexualities, and histories of Australian child refugee policy. A long-time solidarity activist, Jordy regularly works in collaboration with APAN. Yep, so over to you.
Cool. Thanks so much, Tasnim. Yeah, so I want to start by acknowledging that I'm on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people who are here tonight. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I take this seriously. There's not just words to me, as I'm sure they're not just words for everyone else here. They're central to the kind of life that I want to lead, that I try to lead, while living as an uninvited guest, as a coloniser on these lands. Part of my family came here as stateless refugees, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, and this inflects what I say and how I live my life. It means that I live as a descendant of exiles, and I'm also a settler. I have a responsibility with my presence here. I've learned so much from Indigenous peoples, from their creativity, their resistance, their politics, their imagination, their celebration, the way they articulate and describe the world, their staunchness. And I'm humbled to be here speaking on this panel. And while I'm here to talk about solidarity, I want to be clear that I learned so much of my practices of solidarity from all of the other people on this panel, as well as from many others. They all have modelled for me the idea of Palestinians and First Nations peoples and Jews working together, looking out for each other, taking each other's concerns and political projects seriously, supporting their resistance. These people always show up for Jews, and I'm humbled, grateful and honoured to have this opportunity to show up for them now. And it's been clear on social media in recent days that Palestinians in general model how to work in solidarity and show up for others while asserting their claims for justice and freedom. I've learned and am learning so much. I'm also very aware of my own necessary inadequacy in speaking tonight. So I hope what I have to say here is useful for some, but please know that I know my place and that I'm very much still learning, thinking and growing. This work is never done. But solidarity is a practice. It is not mere words that we say, although it is also words. It's choosing the right words, speaking the truth, a truth which Israel wants us not to know, as Tony said, and as everyone has said. Palestinians are clear that what is going on is settler colonialism. They explain how it is so, what this means, what it entails and looks like. They theorise and describe with precision and insight. And so we all must say settler colonialism. We must say that the Nakba continues and that what Palestinians face is nothing short of genocide. We must say that Palestinians have the right of return to all of the land, from the river to the sea. We recognise that the violence that Israel produces and imposes is not unique, but is part of a long history of settler colonial actions around the world. This violence is breathtaking in its force and effects. We said settler colonialism cannot stand, that our solidarity has to involve taking tangible actions where we live and seeing the connections from here to over there. It is clear that Australia and Israel are connected, not just because both are settler colonies and thus maintain similar regimes, practices and ideas of how to enact violence and where that violence is directed, but also because Australia engages militarily and economically with Israel. There is talk of a new free trade agreement, as has been mentioned, and we must oppose it. Similarly, of orbit systems, as Nasser just mentioned. And I just add that Victoria, our supposedly incredibly progressive state that is a pursuer of genocide here and also has an ongoing agreement with orbit systems, and that's something we need to oppose. Israel is a massive arms dealer internationally. An Israeli organisation, Hamushim, does important work documenting this, showing the ways that wars across the world are connected. Our resistance needs to be connected, as it already is. Melanie K. Kantrovitz, a Jewish writer, wrote that, and I quote, "Solidarity is the political version of love." That resonates with me. She talks about the need to learn from Jewish history to, and I quote, "build with allies an urgent and powerful opposition to all hatred." This is a love which I think is generous and capable. It is humble, it is powerful, it is open and bold. It is about showing up even when inconvenient, but also not looking for the inconvenience. Instead, looking for the possibilities that are on offer and grasping them with a full heart. I've been thinking for days about how to speak here, about what will be useful, what I can offer. It's been challenging. And I've returned, as I often do, to the work of these Jewish diasporas who have come before me. And it's notable that in this moment, Israelis and Zionists still, for the most part, cling to an idea of two states. They see some sort of self-determination in the nation state that by design excludes. It's awful. For those who are in Keilani Kauanui's talk this morning, you'll know this. And if you weren't there, I encourage you to find the recording, which I think Tasnim has already shared on Facebook and which will be floating around. But in her talk, Keilani spoke about the limitations on the imagination and on possibilities that international law and the international regime of nation states imposes by linking self-determination and decolonisation to the nation state. We need instead, she showed, a practice of decolonisation that's not tethered to the establishment of nation states. The state is not the answer. So instead I turn to the work of these Jewish diasporas who reject the co-joining of nation and state, who say that Jewishness exceeds that limitation, that self-determination for Jews is not found in the building of a state with borders and Jewish hegemony and exclusivity, but in living amongst others and living across borders. This diasporism is a consciously anti-racist practice. It avoids divisions into groups, recognising that those divisions are created in order to alienate people from each other. El Shahad, an Iraqi Jew, writes of the ways that Mizrahi Jews or Arab Jews are separated by Zionist thinking from the rest of the Middle East. And she argues against such divisions and the violence that they enact. We need to live in the multiplicity of diasporic connections, she shows. Jonathan and Daniel Boyarin write that, and I quote, what we wish to struggle for theoretically is a notion of identity in which there are only slaves but no masters. That is an alternative to the model of self-determination, which is, after all, in itself a Western imperialist imposition on the rest of the world. Jews, they show, have always come from somewhere else. Living amongst others in those elsewhere places is not a sign of lack or of inadequacy, despite what Theodore Herzl and other key Zionists might have said in the past and still say today. Instead, it's a sign of possibility and openness. We are at our best when we are living amongst others, dependent upon each other for life, justice, and safety. We as Jews need to reject clearly the idea that living amongst others makes us weak. It is a foul idea, and yet it persists. It is an idea that is part of this political project that we see in action today, that says that Jews attain power when they have an army, when they have control. But I, along with many others, want to argue for a form of power that is not about control. Kay Kantrovitz writes that, and I quote again, diasporism represents tension, resistance to both assimilation and nostalgia, to both corporate globalization that destroys people and cultures, and to nationalism which promises to preserve people and cultures, but so often distorts them through the prisms of masculinism, racism, and militarism. Jews are not the only people with diasporas, and as Kay Kantrovitz makes clear, this means that we have a ground for speaking with other diasporas, a point of commonality, a language and a practice through which we can articulate and work together. But I want to also be clear, this does not mean that I'm speaking for other diasporas, nor that I'm speaking for what self-determination, liberation, or decolonisation can or should mean for others. I'm very clear that solidarity means not speaking for others. It means listening to and supporting Palestinian and First Nations projects for their own self-determination and decolonisation. A few of us put together a statement from Jews in Australia, clearly opposing what is being done to Palestinians. In it, we say, in part, that we are angered beyond words and that we condemn the military and police attacks on Muslims praying at Al-Aqsa, the stealing of homes in Sheikh Jarrah, the fascist mobs beating up Palestinians in Lid, in Netanya, in Haifa, and throughout 48, the bombings in Gaza, and the ongoing settler violence in the West Bank, that we actively oppose colonialism wherever it appears. We call on the media in this country to do better in their reporting, and we call on people to support BDS. There are currently around 350 signatories. For the context, this is a huge number of people and groups signing on. Change is happening. Solidarity is what will bring change. We must show up when asked. The Palestinian general strike that we are now seeing in the last 24 hours, the Unity Intifada as it has been named, is enormously exciting and inspiring. And the growth of focus on Palestine and Palestinians over the last week, the growth in the number of people who are prepared to say and do something is, it seems to me, encouraging. The sense of possibility that is on offer in this current moment is not to be understated, I don't think. We need to seize on it and help it grow. We need to name the violence and name the resistance, revel in the bravery that we are seeing from Palestine and Palestinians and join their call. Take a risk. It's up to each of us to find the ways that that is possible. It might be a difficult conversation, signing a petition, sharing something on social media, reading, coming to a rally, being clear that Palestinians must be allowed to return to their homes and must not face the ongoing violence that they do. Talking to your workplace about BDS and how you can be involved. Not buying soda streams, don't buy obolo hummus, don't buy Copper Pot or Red Rock Deli dips. It will also be about learning about Indigenous deaths in custody here in the settler colony we live in, seeing the connections between military and police in the settler colonies and the racialised and racist ways in which they enforce state power. Listen and learn, show up, allow yourself to be led, but also to take action. Palestinians can't do everything. We need to work for them and with them. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Jordy. Yeah, you know, I was keen for you to be with us, and I think it's even more important given the current moment. Yeah, and I value your friendship and and your presence in the work that needs to be done and in the fight. So I'll give you all kind of like a moment to think about what kind of questions you'd like us to bring up. But while you do that, maybe let me have a look through here, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about the Albert systems kind of issue, because some of the questions we have are about BDS and about, you know, BDS as something that people here living in this context can participate in, and what it can offer us from our location here. So any one of you, if you wanted to jump in, can talk about that.
Talk about BDS?
Yeah, BDS in relation to like Albert systems, you know, like how does it work? What's the goal? What are we trying to do?
Yep. Thanks so much, Tasnim. And it's a great question, because boycott, divestment and sanctions is in fact what the Palestinians are asking for. Some now 15 years ago, Palestinian civil society met, over 150 different organizations now within Palestine said, we're no to armed resistance. That hasn't worked for us. Negotiations, you know, everybody remembers 1993 and the White House lawns and that handshake and the Nobel Peace Prizes that were passed out. Palestinians were supposed to have a state some 5 years later, and here we are with still Palestinians without self-determination. So the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign has been modelled on the struggle for South Africans to defeat apartheid. So what that means is three things: boycott, divestment, sanction, boycott, BDS. So in that first instance, we want to boycott activities that are aligned with the state of Israel. We want companies and countries, superannuation funds, to divest from their investments in Israel. And the third thing is to sanction the state of Israel, as Australia does currently sanction Iran, North Korea. We've put Myanmar on the list now. Russian officials are being sanctioned and boycotted. So too should we be holding Israel to account. With respect to Albert, and as I spoke about before, Albert is a criminal enterprise with the blood of Palestinian children on its hands. Promoting its products is battle tested. They have their head office here in Victoria. Victoria has engaged in contracts with them. The Defence Department's dumped them. So we'd call upon the Victorian government to do the same thing. They also want to build their research centre of excellence. And this should be something so unpalatable to Australians of good conscience that we would even possibly entertain, for fiscal advantage, a connection with a company that is so horribly inhumane. So what does that look like for you? Jordy spoke about it. You know, don't buy a soda stream. If any of your friends is thinking about buying one of those machines, tell them why they shouldn't be buying them. We should be discouraging and writing to our members of parliament, explaining to them why the action on Tuesday being led by the West Papuans, who are also suffering under the disgusting brutality of Albert systems. And here's Albert selling their stuff to the Indonesians, a Muslim country, to oppress an Indigenous people in West Papua. So this is why when I talk about the domino, why it's so important. So things you can do: write to your press, speak to your friends, write to the press, speak to your friends, speak to your parliamentarians, and speak to them particularly on a state level, but also nationally about it. You can go to Google BDS and bdsmovement.net and bdsaustralia.org, and you can find out a little bit more about our activities here in Australia. I'm also a board member there.
Thank you.
That was the activist pitch.
Yeah, no, that's awesome.
Oh, there's one thing you got to remember is the domino.
Yeah, stop.
Palestine's the domino.
No, it's really it's really important. And I think also, like, in addition to, obviously, because with the Albert systems, it's not one that can be done like individually. So there are some that are kind of consumer boycott, and that's a question I've been having like outside this particular forum, but other people have been asking. But I think Albert systems really demonstrates that it kind of like, the general strike that's happening in Palestine. To be able to oppose Albert systems, you really need a kind of collective coming together, and a kind of anti-colonial refusal, because it's not something that, like, we're not the ones who are buying Albert systems. This is something done on many levels. It's like really intersectional. Like it's, you see the capitalist interests, the state interests, all of that coming together to create that kind of violent.
It's militaristic capitalism to chauvinist extreme. I mean, these are the companies that, Saudi Arabia bought their stuff, out of Israel, to how they tracked Khashoggi, sucked him into the Turkish embassy and murdered him. These Israeli companies will sell this stuff to the most despotic regimes, and we know what the culmination of these products is. They don't make the world a better place. We're not curing cancer with this stuff. We're not feeding children. We're not housing homeless. We're not saving the climate. This stuff is used to oppress people.
Yeah.
Stuff is used to oppress people. Victoria, as a citizen of the state of Victoria, not in my name. I don't want to dealing with Albert. And the things we can do as human beings, because it's not a consumer boycott, we can hold our decision makers to account. Attend the rally on Tuesday. We'll put that, I think Tasnim's going to put those.
Yeah, I'll put it.
Yeah. And let's hold them to account.
I wanted to see if Sary or Jordy wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think discussing Albert systems is a really interesting one, but also just kind of reflecting on what Nasser said earlier on, in terms of these intergenerational relationships and sort of seeing a lot of fatigue in our parents' generation and seeing this sort of intergenerational change. I think that one of the things about the current day is that it is very easy with digital technology to organize in much larger ways than our parents' generation could. And I do think that this, it's not just about forums like this, but also, I think it's very easy today to write a letter to your local MP to put pressure to, I've had many dear friends in the last week or two who've written very kind messages to me just saying, hey, how are you doing? Which is really lovely. But actually, it's not that hard to write a similar email to your MP, to write a similar email to your senator, to lobby the government, to make all of these sorts of decisions. And, we also live in a digital age. It's very easy to follow different Palestinians on Facebook or Instagram or social media and get news directly from the source. I mean, I think, a lot of, obviously you want to be careful about where you're getting your news from, and you want to be a little bit critical about it, but there is a lot of information that's out there that's direct, coming out directly from the sort of the ground. And I think, following those sorts of things is really important. I also think that publicizing things that are going on, there's so many Palestinian institutions like Dar Jasser in Bethlehem, like that I mentioned in my talk, who are sort of talking about what's, how these sort of current moments are affecting them. I think, publishing that sort of stuff, even with the sort of ways in which algorithms are biased against Palestinian content, it's really important for that stuff to be circulating. So I think, I would just really encourage people to be kind of circulating this material out there. Yeah.
Yeah. Jordy, did you want to comment on this one, or I can?
Let's go to another question, I reckon.
All right, cool. So one question was like, in terms of I think for the APAN campaign yesterday, there was 10,000 letters that were sent to MPs in relation to stopping the bombings, which is a huge achievement. That was done in one day. So you can see that the momentum, there's this spark that seems a bit unprecedented in a way as well. But the question is, what is the significance of this? And what's the next step? How do we capitalize on and build from involvement in, you know, an action like this? Anyone? Whoever would like to jump
I
in.
might just start because as an elder, just very quickly, the number is actually closer to 13,000 now, which is amazing. And what it says to us is what we know, that overwhelmingly the majority of Australians can smell it. And I say can smell it because, you know, actually it's just been said to us, 13,593. And say it smell it because, you know, Christina Holgate lost her job at Australia Post because it didn't pass the pub test. Well, the reality is that Israel's occupation of Palestine, Israel's denial of Palestinians' rights to self-determination, Israel holding 2 million Gazans in a gauge and turning the pressure cooker up or down as and when it decides, doesn't pass the pub test. To launch a campaign where people, we're going to say the threshold for activation for people in activist communities has a measure. Getting people to storm a protected building with armed guards is the highest level of activation possible. The lowest level of activation possible is honking your horn as you drive past the protest in support. So filling in a survey where you are sending your name, address, and email to your local parliamentarian is closer. Although it doesn't actually take a lot of work, it is actually closer to storming barricades than beeping at a protest in solidarity, because you are in fact giving up, you're outing yourself. And when we think about that from the point of view and the perspective of a member of parliament and their constituency, when they're getting, and let's say there's 13,000, and let's say, you know, one member of parliament might have got 100 letters. They know that each phone call they get, email they get, concerned letter they get actually corresponds to somewhere between 10 and 1,000 constituents. So when they get 13, almost 14,000 of these letters of people activated, we're talking about tens and hundreds of thousands of people that are concerned about this. So it's really, really important. So I can't lost my train of thought a little bit, but I think it's great, and I encourage anybody who hasn't signed it to do sign it and share it.
I also agree that I think that kind of action is really important. It's easy to do, and it kind of just something that kind of I reflect on is, you know, and we got a question about this as well, like what comes in the way? For example, why is it that the media doesn't cover something like this, or doesn't cover, you know, demonstrations all across the continent? And, you know, why is it that despite like worldwide protests and demonstrations against, for example, the siege on Gaza, the siege has been sustained and continued for almost 15 years. Like what's, you know, if you could talk to that, like what's going on, I don't know, Jordy, do you want to?
I mean, yeah, I would say a few things. Firstly, I think it's part of, I mean, it's the left, but not just the left. Left, that's too small, but I mean, we've utterly failed in Australia. Like none of our actions really, like in recent years on everything, right? Like the way this country treats refugees, the way it treats First Nations people, the way it treats the environment. We are not in a good global moment when in this country or anything. And I think Palestine is part of that. So I think that's one explanation, but it's not a whole explanation. I think another explanation is that there's no question that there are Zionist pressure, that Zionist groups are highly organised and are regularly pressuring various different types of people that have power to put out narratives. So politicians, media, all sorts of places. And many of us have felt that in different ways. But the reason it's effective is not because the people that they're pressuring actually care about Jews or actually care if they're anti-Semitic. They're anti-Semitic all the time. But this provides a helpful cover for them not to do anything that could jeopardize them in any way. They can just say, oh, you know, we got lobbied, it's so much pressure, I'm worried about a phone call. And really it helps them do what they were going to do anyway, which is just not care because they're racist, right? So it's all part of this kind of cycle that fulfills each other, and they can point responsibility at somebody else, say it's too hard, and that's what it ends up being. So I think, you know, that pressure exists, but it's effective because the racism and anti-Semitism also exists. But we also need to recognise that that pressure does exist, and we need to fight against it very clearly. But we need to be anti-racist in general so that the pressure, you know, can't have the effect that it has. Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I'd say.
Yeah. Sary, do you want to jump in? I'll give you a chance.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there is an awful lot of pressure, and I think, you know, particularly overseas, we've seen almost a criminalization of Palestine in certain jurisdictions. You know, we've seen Germany, for instance, and France both enact legislation that if you're pro-BDS, you will no longer be eligible to receive public funds. We've seen scholars like Akili Mbembe, you know, being banned from entering Europe. So I think, you know, there is also a sort of a sense in which there's a battleground that's before the actual battle, which is whether we are allowed to actually even have these discussions in the first place, that I think is really important to address. But as I mean, you know, I think in the current moment, you know, often when we see these sorts of flare-ups in Palestine, I feel quite helpless. But actually, you know, in the last week or so, speaking to friends who are in Palestine, I think there is a sense actually of something positive and some sort of like even a sense of optimism at the moment. And I think that that's something that's really good for us to bear in mind. Like, I think it's very easy to be pessimistic about the situation. And I think, you know, having a constructive attitude and having, I mean, I know it sounds a little bit trite, but being a little bit kind to one another and building these sort of sense of solidarity and, you know, I think, you know, the sort of taking the time to have a discussion about something with people rather than assuming that that people won't kind of engage is a really important thing. You know, I think particularly with the rise of identity politics, I think it's very easy for people to kind of, you know, get very angry very quickly about certain things not being understood. But actually, I do think, you know, we ultimately do want to get the message out there. And I think taking the time to have constructive discussions with people is a really useful thing. You know, I recently saw Matt Chun, who's a cartoonist who often produces work for Dumbo Feather, a magazine in Melbourne, you know, making inquiries as to whether Dumbo Feather was going to make comment about what's going on, and Dumbo Feather responding that no, they won't. And I think, you know, he published that material in a series of Instagram posts. I don't think that means that we should be attacking Dumbo Feather, but I think we should be encouraging them to actually speak out, you know. I think that there are so many of these sort of situations in which approaching them in a sort of a way that is a little bit calmer perhaps, but also very direct and very sort of assertive and has very concrete aims is a really important thing. And I think, you know, when I think back to the very beginning of what this forum was supposed to be, you know, we were supposed to be discussing the right of return. Yeah. And that's sort of very much been eclipsed. But I think, you know, I think the right of return is a perfect example of this. You know, it's like, I mean, we all support the right of return, but what does that tangibly look like? You know, I think we need to be thinking about things in very, very tangible terms at the moment and in constructive terms. You know, if we did have a right of return tomorrow, I mean, there are more Palestinians outside of historical Palestine within it. How do we accommodate potentially 10 million Palestinians returning? So I think it's really good to be actually planning for the future in really concrete and tangible ways, and working with people in these broad alliances. And I really, I think often we get into these very divisive debates, and I think it's a time for unity. And I think the fact that people are calling this the Unity Intifada, it speaks volumes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fragmentation, geographic, political, social, all of these things. But I think it's a time for us to all be very constructively coming together and working towards a similar aim.
I wanted to, I can't hear you.
We can't hear you, Nasser.
Sorry, I had muted myself because I was coughing before. I just want to add something to what Sary was saying about the right of return. Salman Abu Sitta, who's the Palestine Land Society, who published this book, The Atlas of Palestine, has done an immense amount of work. Palestinians pre-48 and most Palestinian refugees, the overwhelming majority, are in fact refugees from rural areas. And in excess of 80% of Palestinians can return to, if not their land, they're very, very close to the historical land. So I'm not sure the 10 million Palestinians would want to go back. I think my right is inalienable. My children might want to go back. Like Tasnim, she should have a right to go there as a Palestinian, not as an Australian. I'm pretty comfortable here, but it's my right to choose what I choose to do.
Yeah. And what I wanted to kind of jump in on is, the campaign that's supporting Sheikh Jarrah, and the way that maybe it kind of has kind of like why that particularly has sparked so much engagement from people who generally don't relate to the Palestine solidarity movement. Some things that might be is because it's really about preventing something from happening. So I feel like Mohammed Al-Kurd, he's very determined to have a win on this. Like, that's it. Like, no matter what, you're not kicking us out. Like, we're not leaving. And I think that's the slogan, like, Lan narhal, and it ties to Jerusalem. And we have one question here about that as well, like the way that, for Palestinians, for Palestinian Muslims, like Jerusalem has its weight, and it's a focal point in relation to this ethnic cleansing. And it's part of the reason why Jerusalem particularly hasn't been completely colonized as yet. Like, yes, it's occupied, but compared to other areas, because there were kind of like during that moment of anti-colonialism and independence, I think at some Arab states kind of, it was different at that time. Whereas now, like Trump could only hand over do the embassy move, let's say, so there's something different now that's kind of escalating the situation, but at the same time, making a lot of Palestinians really like vigilant and saying like, no, you're not going to proceed with this ethnic cleansing. Like we're gonna put like this red line. You're not gonna expel almost 1,000 or I saw some figures where 3,000 of us and make us homeless and replace us with these settler organizations that are very organized, funded, etc. They're not gonna get away with this. So I was just wondering, if you kind of feel similarly or read it in a different way, like what is it particularly about, Save Sheikh Jarrah or supporting Sheikh Jarrah that's bringing us to this moment?
So I just want to very quickly address a couple of points here. Firstly, Sheikh Jarrah is singular and it's not isolated. Silwan is under the same eviction notices. The Hebron Hills, Jordy spent a lot of time there, same situation in Hebron. Throughout what is East Jerusalem, there are thousands of houses that have been demolished and tens of thousands that have demolition orders. The challenge with the capturing or the reunification of Jerusalem in 1967 from a Zionist perspective is that the Nakba 48 was planned. Plan Delit, Ilan Papi, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, details specifically how it was. And historians, revisionist historians of Israel, talk about one of two parts. What a terrible thing we need to make amends for. And then you've got the Benny Morris thing, we didn't do a good enough job because we left enough of them back here. And the reality of the 67 war, the reunification of Jerusalem, is that the tanks went quicker than the buses. And I say the tanks went quicker than the buses because the tanks got to the Jordan River before the buses of Palestinians left. So the actual ethnic cleanse didn't happen quick enough. It's not that the Jerusalem Palestinians didn't fear for their lives, didn't want to run. The tanks were already ahead of them, so they were on this side. And so from our perspective, when I say, it's been phenomenal, the reunification of the Palestinian movement within 48, 67, Jerusalem, Gaza, etc., was Sheikh Jarrah. But it is, although we had the Aqsa uprising and demonstrations there, it is secular. It has united us not because we're Muslim, not because we're Christian. You reunited us because of our shared pain, and the fact is we're not going to let it happen again.
I mean, I think Trump's embassy move in some ways was one of the best things that could have happened to Palestinians. I really do. I think it exposed American foreign policy in a way that most Palestinians, I mean, we all knew exactly how America and its foreign policy had functioned for decades. And I think it made this really visible. I think that in some ways it has kind of taken America out of this role of looking like some sort of neutral arbiter to sort of showing its very fundamental bias. And I think that has been really, really phenomenal, actually. I'm not saying that this embassy move is a good thing or the recognition of sovereignty is a good thing, but I think we need to sort of also think about the broader context of what's going on on both sides of the Green Line. I mean, Israel has just been through its 4th election in 18 months and still does not have a government. It's very clear that Netanyahu is is incredibly corrupt and is a war criminal and has very little legitimacy. It's also very clear that both of the two big Israeli blocs in electoral politics could have very easily formed government if only they dealt with the Palestinian citizens that also live within the sort of the boundaries of 1948, and I think when we kind of look at what's going on and, I think really we're in this very unique position right now where there is not a single government that has any sort of legitimacy between the river and the sea. And I think, in some ways this underscores the bottom up kind of, challenge that Palestine has always been, is that it is very fundamentally about a grassroots movement that is about solidarity, both within that region and from outside of it. So I think as we kind of see this sort of like lack of legitimacy that any of these states actually have, it's a really important time to be rethinking what sort of political structures we want to see there. And if we zoom out even a little bit further from that, we've seen the troubles that are going on in Jordan, we've seen, the context in Lebanon, it's like this is a region that is about to go through a very major transformation, in this sort of post-Arab Spring kind of context. And I think it's really important to be, as I said, thinking in very concrete terms about what we want to see happen. How do we want to live in the future? How do we want to see this region function? How do we want to deal with our neighbors? How do we want to create some sort of very genuine and long-lasting peace? I mean, there are very clearly structures that need to be dismantled, but there's also very clearly structures that need to be built at the same time. So I think it's a very vital juncture at the moment.
Yeah, there was a question for you, Jordy, so maybe you could jump in on this kind of idea of I think we're talking about like statist, anti-status politics. I think you're kind of gesturing to that anyway. So the question that was there for you was in relation to Jewish people in diaspora and kind of Zionism and the vision that Zionism offers. And the question is like, how can that be challenged around the world? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And it ties in well to what I would have said to the last question, which is where I'm actually seeing a lot more people who have never been prepared to say something publicly challenging what Israel does and what Zionism is, asking questions now. You know, I've had people saying, you know, something, it's hard to talk about, it's quite awful, but, you know, they understand, they understand why Gaza is being bombed, as disgusting as that is, we would all agree, but they can understand that, but they're like, but why are people being kicked out of their homes? Like, what's that about? That makes no sense to me. And there's something which, you know, anyway, we'll park the critique for a moment, but there is something in that, and there's definitely more people speaking about this, and actually was interviewed by a reporter for an article that will be coming out in the next couple of days, I think, about this question about the more Jews, Zionists around the world, particularly in Australia and the US, is what the article is looking at, are questioning what's going on. And I think what it will take is concerted work by me and by other Jews, and it's about talking to people, and it's a long project, and I'm having lots of conversations with people who are talking to their families and are talking to their friends, and in all the Jewish Facebook groups are talking about these conversations, sometimes in really painful and cringy ways, but they're talking about it, and they're talking about like, what's the, you know, let's strategize together. How do you answer this question? Can anyone give me tips on, you know, how to answer this kind of question that I'm getting? And people are working together really like internationally. You know, there's Facebook groups that are Jews are out from all around the world talking about how can we have these conversations? How can we frame what needs to be said in ways which will cut through? But also, how can we, you know, sometimes you want to meet people where they're at and try to move them. And sometimes you have to say, you know, where you're at is wrong, and I'm going to stand over here, and one day you're going to get to me, and you're going to get to me, and that's fine. And it's about making strategic decisions and emotional decisions about the people that you want to do that, which approach to take. But it's also about not being held back by the people who say we should be held back, you know, that, you know, in this statement that now, you know, around 350 people have signed on to, we make a call for BDS. We say we support BDS. I don't know that this might be the biggest group of Australian Jews in Australia who have signed on to something that supports BDS, you know, like that feels kind of huge to me. Taking into account that maybe they didn't all read the whole statement, but still they signed it, you know. They trusted, they read what they read, they trusted it enough to sign on to it. Things are shifting, and it's just a matter of being bold, but also acting. And that's not a task for Palestinians in the slightest. That is not, you know, yeah. I think I've seen, you know, Nasser engaged with one of my very racist cousins on Facebook yesterday. And I was just like, Nasser, no, just don't engage with him. Which I didn't tell him. But like, you guys should not have to be burdened by that. That's a task for us and a task for everybody to do. And I think if you don't know how to talk to people as well, then don't. Like, that's fine. Leave the work for somebody else. I'm talking to, I guess, white people who are watching us. So pick your sorry.
So it's 9 o'clock, so maybe we'll wrap up like at 9:10. But one question that, so there's also a Muslim open letter that's being drafted that kind of similarly tries to work through a principled approach in kind of, so it's critiquing faith washing and the way that it plays a role in the normalization of Israeli settler colonization. So it's kind of similar to the Jewish letter, but this one is a Muslim-centered one. It discusses like Islamic concepts of justice, and then, yeah, tries to push against some of these, the way that, you know, these faith groups, they come together a lot of the time through pressure from government, you know, multiculturalism. And that's why I thought I'd bring that up in relation to, Sary, what you're talking about, like in terms of futures and what kind of futures we want to see. Because the way that I think groups end up participating in that faith washing is through a limited perception of the future. Like they're not really thinking about those implications, more like, yeah, we're just working here in Australia and we're doing this over here, and not really taking on that kind of moral burden in a way. And Sary, you were talking a little bit about cultural diplomacy as well. So maybe like as we can go around like some final points. Yeah, talking about futures, ways that we can move forward from this moment, from our different locations, positionalities, etc. Because I feel like we've unpacked a lot, but it'd be interesting to hear from each of you on that. I don't know, Sary, if you want to go first.
Want me to start? Okay. Yeah, look, I mean, I think, look, I mean, my background is in culture and researching culture, both sort of visual culture and cultural policy. And I think, you know, I mean, I think that we have seen Israeli Hasbara, which is such a well-funded sort of a thing, but actually, I think, all right, let's take this, actually, I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction. So let's think about Palestine historically, which is a very multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, pluralistic space. So late Ottoman and British Mandate Palestine, you know, we have this whole series of networks in which Palestine is kind of a nexus. So we have, you know, obviously the three big religions, you know, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And for those of you who don't know, there is actually an indigenous Jewish population. It's not solely a case of settler colonial kind of sort of Zionist expansionism. So we sort of need to be thinking about that as well. But when we look at the way Palestine functioned historically, it was as these series of networks that connected to the world in very different ways. And we tend to think about Palestine as a space which was colonized and was fought over. We obviously have, you know, British and French colonialism. We have attempts by other European governments, the Italians, for instance. Mussolini certainly had his own sort of politic in the region. We obviously had this big Turkish influence, etc. But actually within all of that, there was constantly this sense of Palestinian agency. And I think that's something that we don't really see so much anymore. And when we look at the ways in which Palestine was promoted and the ways in which it functions, and even in a contemporary sense, really wonderful institutions like the Palestinian Film Festival, or this sort of export of Palestinian art that is, I mean, it's, you know, it's a phenomenal industry. You know, I think we need to be thinking in a cultural sense about Palestine, because actually this is one of the best ways of kind of understanding the contemporary situation. I think a film like The Wanted 18, for instance, you know, it talks, which I don't know how many of you might have seen it, but the sort of the premise is that it's set during the First Intifada. During the First Intifada, there was a big curfew, so there were these 18 cows that were bought by the people of Beit Zahur, and they were using it to generate milk during this curfew. And this film, you know, it sort of takes a humorous tone, but it also thinks not only about Palestinian agency within that context, but the sort of leftist global links and all of these sort of different politics. And I think when we start conceiving of Palestine as a much more pluralistic space than, and one that sort of connects to the world in these many multifarious relationships, then we can start sort of thinking about something that approximates a future.
Yeah, thank you. And I find that really kind of motivating as well. Like it gives you, it gives you a drive. It gives you something to imagine. Jordy, do you want to go next? And then I wanted to let Nasser have like a few final remarks.
I don't know that I have much to add. I think Sary just spoke so beautifully. I just don't know that I have much to add. Sorry. Yeah, I would rather hear from Nasser. Yeah.
Handy. So I was hoping that you compliment Sary there, Jordy. Can I just say it is beautiful to listen to both of you talk. And thank you so much for being part of this panel, and Tasnim, congratulations for putting it together. And I think at some point we had like 220 people watching, so that's fantastic. And I'm sure you'll make the video available offline. I often think about tomorrow, and my tomorrow exists in a world that my dad grew up in, and the Palestine my dad grew up in the 20s and 30s. The smells were the same smells of Jerusalem. The sounds were the same sounds of Jerusalem. There was Hebrew, and there was Arabic, and there was English, and there was French and Turkish, and he played marbles on Monday. Ibrahim, and Avraham played marbles together. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Ibrahim went to mosque. Saturday, Avraham went to temple. And on Sunday, Abraham went to church. And on Monday, they played marbles together. My dad's first girlfriend was Julie. And that's the world I imagine, not just for Palestine, but for all of us. It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. My dad was a Muslim, married a Christian. Both my brothers, one married a Catholic, the other married I'm pretty sure she's secular, agnostic, whatever. I married a Muslim woman. It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. And the fact that an external ideology, Zionism, came to a land with multiple cultures, multiple religions, and believed and claimed that that land is Jewish, and that Jewish supremacism supersedes everybody else's culture and land in a land since time immemorial. And if you do believe that your religion supersedes everybody's in that land with multiple cultures and religion, then you're a Jewish supremacist, you're a racist. And you're not part of our future, and you're not, I think we've seen in the past year, 2 years in fact, between Me Too and between George Floyd and the BLM movement, a greater connectedness of people, the internet, Zoom, etc. COVID's taught us how to, as Sary spoke about, how to connect, how to mobilize, how to activate networks, things that were denied, my father's generation and those before. And I'm much happier with what we're selling than what the right wing and Netanyahu's mates, including ScoMo, including Bojo, including all those right-wing nutjobs. I'm much happier with our product.
Yeah, and including states who appropriate, the Palestinian struggle to further their own kind of oppressive repression.
We've always been a football that people use to say, "Hey, look, I am the champion."
So I just want, to note that, like, because it came through in the comment.
Yeah. I mean, it's Erdogan today, but I mean, Saddam Hussein did it, Assad's did it,
Yeah.
They've all done it.
But yeah, I find that like a really powerful way to kind of end this kind of discussion, because it really is a huge contrast to like the apartheid, the genocidal logics, which don't, a lot of the time people think about Palestine, think about Palestinian death and suffering, which of course, but it's also like what you're saying, like it's a destruction of life affirming ways. It's a destruction of how we can be together, how we can so that's all really relevant and needs to be centered when we talk about Palestine as well, and the kind of the violence that the Zionist settler colonial project inflicts. It's there is so much that is implicated in its continued existence in the way it is, and it's a huge contrast to kind of like the ethno-nationalist Jewish only kind of state that it's. Yeah, we've got some kind of Zionists here who've been.
Isn't that the best? We're talking about a world where we're hugging and homeless are housed and kids are educated.
Yeah.
And our mate, Free
We
Israel's
haven't been
gone.
giving them air, so they.
That is the best way. We're going to win, buddy.
Yeah.
Watch the domino.
So before I close, I'll just make a few announcements. So we've got the rally on Saturday. We're expecting a huge demonstration, maybe one of the largest we've had. It's 1 p.m. State Library. If you want to be involved in the movement, we're also holding a post-rally public discussion. So it'll be at one of the parks where the march will end. So you can stay around for that. And of course, on Tuesday, there's the Albert Systems action that is led by West Papua. So I hope that this will give you a lot to kind of, get involved in, and hopefully that will be for the long term, because I think the Palestine Solidarity Movement needs you to be able to sustain itself locally. But yeah, thank you all. I'll hang around, but yeah, feel free.
We've got to answer these nut jobs and then hang up on them. Sorry,
Yeah.
Jordy. I know Jordy doesn't like me doing it.
I don't even know what they're saying here.
Oh, you're missing nothing. Anyway.
Yeah.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much, everyone,
guys.
for coming along.
Yeah.
I want to say thank you to everyone that joined us today. Thank you so much. And I appreciate everyone coming in to our panelists and everyone here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shams. And Shams has been working a lot in the background, all the Free Palestine Melbourne team, but also coalition at the moment because of the urgency of the situation, APAN, PCA, BDS Australia, etc., CAF, all coming together to sustain Palestine organizing. And I do hope we do see a win in terms of, Sheikh Jarrah, like that they just basically abandon those plans, but we'll see. Yeah.
We're winning already. We're winning.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Can we just get rid of, close out the participants and just leave the panel for a moment also?
Yeah, we could do that.